The Life of Lazarillo de Tormes is one of the more important works of the Spanish Siglo de Oro for a number of reasons. It's published in the 1550s, a couple generations after the momentous developments of 1492. And it takes a real hard look at what has become of Spain in the decades that followed, and the undercurrents of society in what is supposed to be the golden age. It is taking a look at the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum. Now, significantly, it is also then, as an examination of the underclass, so to speak, it is perhaps the first primary example we have of the so-called Picaresque novel, which is a story of usually a rogue of some form, somebody who is on the margins of society, usually a member of the underclass, who goes on a series of episodic adventures and gives usually a first-person account, an eyewitness account of culture on the lower end of the economic scale. And you get an awful lot of irony packed into that, because the characters are almost always, as they're noting ordinary, everyday reality for them is somewhat morally questionable, perhaps. This is not this is not the perspective that is supposed to be enlightening in the exemplary way. It is a cautionary tale, if anything. And so you get this little character who tells a story laid out in fairly neat chronology, where he's going around and just seeing things and getting involved in people's lives in a fairly episodic way, one after the other after the other. And there's not necessarily a lot of cross-reference between them, between the episodes, but it's through this you get snapshots of society that can be very funny, very entertaining, and very critical. Lazarillo de Tormes takes on, in a very real way, the power structure of his age, and just really harshly criticizing the aristocracy, the Catholic Church more than anything, and the hypocrisies that they see in society, not from the elevated, cultured perspective, but from a ground level, the so-called worm's eye view of society. And it's really remarkable for that. It is, of course, published anonymously presumably because of the heat that such criticism tends to attract in powerful authoritarian governments. They don't tend to like criticism, and so it is published anonymously and circulated widely as its reputation grows. And it's just a fun work to get through. It's not long. It's a fairly quick read. I'm a slow reader, and I read it very quickly. But there's so much there that you can dig into, and really, if you want to go slow with it, and I always kind of recommend that, if you want to go slow with it, even then, it's not a big time investment, because it's just simple. It begins with a prologue, which is significant, and it's not something to just sort of blast past as, well, I want to get to the story. It lays out what's going on and how the frame of how the story should be understood. And it begins, I believe that things worthy of attention shouldn't be left unheard and unseen, buried in the grave of oblivion. which automatically is a challenge to convention, to the idea that, well, okay, only certain people are worthy of consideration, only certain aspects of society are worthy of consideration, and that there are only certain perspectives that we should engage with. Here is a remarkably democratizing opinion getting thrust into that, saying, no, everything deserves a representation in the panorama of humanity. So right off the bat. And then he goes on, he quotes Pliny. You know, in this sense, there is no book, as Pliny says, however bad it might be, without something good in it, which is an interesting notion. The idea, again, of the overlooked, the underrepresented, we need to engage with that as well if we want a full picture of reality, but also a kind of relativism. You can't poo-poo something just because, you know, well, no, that's just not okay. You can't reject that. This is making the case that if it is human, it is inherently valuable. There is that Renaissance tradition leading back to the classics. You know, the Roman playwright Terence saying, you know, nothing human is alien to me. The notion that we can't overlook that just because parts of it are bad. There are good and bad in everything. It's moral relativism of a sort, and that will be developed throughout. But you can't turn your back on it. They also quote Cicero very archly, saying, you know, as Cicero states thus, honor nurses art. Honor and art. The idea that, well, no, art is, you know, is founded on honor. And then, of course, throughout the course of the book, you see dishonorable behavior from everybody that it portrays. The whole book is made up of scoundrels and rogues and the underclass cheating and scamming one another, and sometimes worse. But that's not honorable. But is this art then? A little questionable. But at the very beginning of the book, these are the questions that the book is posing, that it's tossing up there. And as it gets underway, they introduce this character, Lazaro. Lazarillo is the diminutive, of course, of that in Spanish. So little Lazarillo. It begins when he is born. And it makes a point of saying, you know, I'm not going to go in for all that in media res stuff in the middle of things, as classical authors will. So, you know, I'm just going to start with when I was born, which is honestly the beginning of the novel as a historical and artistic genre. Because a novel typically traces a character, at least at the early years of it, from birth to death. And the classical conception of narration tended to skew to only like a certain arrangement of developments and events and plot, artfully arranged, but you begin in the middle, in the action, get things moving. This is throwing that out, and this will inaugurate what will become, in the centuries following, the novel as we know it today. But little Lazarillo is the little boy. Lazaro is the grown man telling the story. And it plays with this throughout, where it is very conscious that this is a grown man now telling the story of his youth. And he will sporadically hint that he is shading things just a little bit, coloring it, because he has obviously a very troubled youth, very adventurous, but there's some moral sketchiness going on there. And he is now an older and more respected member of society who is maybe just trying to put a happy face on it and make it seem like a organized little story of how he grew from a troubled beginning to a respectable position in society. Maybe that's the story. I tend not to think so, and the events that actually seep up over or underneath all of that happy talk suggest otherwise, but that's the dynamic that they're playing with. So you can't really just gloss over, oh, okay, well, what happens for the story? Because realistically, the entire book is more about that interplay of what happened and how is it being represented, and how is it being remembered, how is it being recorded and offered up as consideration. It is addressed to someone of some importance. The narrator makes frequent reference or appeal to vuestra merced, your mercy, just addressing them directly, and you're not quite sure what this is supposed to be. You get the sense that he, as an adult, Lazaro is trying to tell his story in a way that, like when you're writing your college application essays, you're trying to give a sense of sweep that will impress people with the trajectory of it from, lowly beginnings to the heights of respectability, implying that you will just keep climbing after that point if you're still alive, as he is. And that tension is always there, and it's fun to watch. Anyway, Lazaro, completely unremarkable beginnings, completely unremarkable person by any gauge, and yet he gets to tell a story. He's reading about it, kind of linking back to the St. Augustine Confessions, where even a nobody is allowed to tell their story, and we can find value in that. And the matching of St. Augustine with Lazarillo de Tormes is automatically, again, sort of ironic, because there's a little bit of a moral misjuncture there. And the fact that, Augustine is a founder, he is a founder of the modern Catholic Church, and Lazaro is not. Lazaro tells a story of his young boyhood. His father was he was born in a mill over a river. Significantly, symbolically, river is always moving. It is unstable. It is a very poor foundation. Is that the modern world? Is that the modern character? I don't know, but you can see he is clearly, it's not a noble beginning. It is not a structured beginning. He is not building a life out of a foundation that is stable, as perhaps the aristocracy or the better, or not even the aristocracy, but the middle class and the respectable people. He does not have that. He doesn't have that advantage. His father is also a little morally skeptical or a little sketchy, and he is a thief, and he gets arrested, and he is he's basically made a slave to a nobleman who goes off to war, and Lazaro's father is thus killed. He probably didn't want to go to the war. He had no choice because he was a servant to the gentleman who was, to the aristocrat. That's life in the lower classes. You don't get to choose how you die. Lazaro's mom, single mom now, presumably mourns for a little while, but starts spending some time with a local blacksmith or something. He is a Moor. He is a black man, and he comes by every now and then. And Lazaro knows that when he shows up, well, okay, we're gonna get some food. At first, he's a little, hey, you're not my dad, but then he realizes that the guy brings presents. The guy brings food. So hey, mom's inside. And you know, things happen. Lazaro gets a new little brother, a little black boy, who very significantly is raised as, raised as any other child in the family, and the child actually turns in horror at one point. As a toddler, you get a sense, when he recognizes that he looks different than Lazaro and his mom, and he looks more like the guy who comes over every now and then. And it's uncomfortable. And the child turns in horror. And you can look into this a bunch of different ways. But he screams, and, I don't want to look like him, whatever. And Zaid reacts somewhat, he takes some umbrage to being, assaulted by his own child like this. And he calls him, hijo de puta, son of a whore. This is Lazaro's mom that he's talking about. Lazaro just sort of witnesses this. He says, oh yeah, he called him son of a, oh, that's my brother. We have the same mom. Is my mom a whore? But that sense of also sketchiness, underbelly of society, moral question, but also, the son of a whore, meaning this isn't attributed directly to Lazaro, but you can see it sort of tangentially. Obviously, it means the same thing. But the son of is a sense of heredity. Your heredity is cheap and morally suspect, and these are the sorts of things that will dog you and frame your identity. In the world, we are a product of the generations who come before us. And in this world, in Spain in the 1500s, who your parents were very significant. Zaid, significantly, is there's not a lot made of his religion, but as a black man, he is very likely a Muslim, a Moor, or at least a converso, one who had converted from that background. And the idea of there were, as official policy in Spain at the time, two different classes of people. Now, they got rid of, in 1492, they banished all the non-Catholics. So Jews and Muslims were all thrown out, or told that they could convert. If they converted, they could stay. If they didn't, they had to leave. But from there, persecution continued, and if you were a converso, you were less than. You weren't a real Spaniard. And that little dynamic is playing here in a very personal way of, just very young children dealing with this dynamic. And through this story is bringing out all of these little characteristics of the society and making people look at them and say, well, that doesn't seem quite right, or, that's come on, little kids. And it's making its point very subtly in ways that, because of the funniness of it, because we're talking about, like, a couple of rogues who are out doing what, the base human people do, it can be funny, and it is, but there's resonance there, there's significance there, and there are there's some real teeth in terms of the social criticism. Zaid turns out he's been stealing. Lazaro is questioned about it, and under interrogation, he admits, because they threatened me to make me talk, and since I was still just a boy, I was terrorized, I testified, and even described how I sold to a blacksmith and blah, 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 blah. So he's admitting that, I ratted out my stepdad. My poor stepfather was whipped and basted with boiling oil. My mother was put on trial, which resulted not only in the usual punishment of 10 lashes, but her being forbidden to enter the house of the aforementioned commendador and to have an aggrieved Zaid in her house. So, the family's broken up, and his step-parents are separated, but also individually tortured. This is an ugly little episode, but it goes by very quickly, very trippingly almost. And it's somewhat shocking in how blasé it is. And when you recall again that this is an older person talking about this, and telling this story from a certain distance and psychological makeup and trying to arrange the details of the story in certain ways, it's really quite complicated. I mean, is this something that he is admitting without trying to think about too much? He just admits it on the surface, but is there conflict behind that? Is he really that callous now? Yeah, I sold out my parents, and they were all tortured for it, but what are you gonna do? It's uncomfortable. From there, Lazaro is basically sold off by his mom. His mom can't take care of him. She is now on her own again, and without real means of support, she unloads her son, essentially. Now, this begins his life. This begins his journeys and his picaresque adventures, where he goes through a series of so-called masters who take him under their wing for different reasons. Generally as he's an assistant and an apprentice, a low-level employee helping. And the first person who comes up is a blind man. We're never told his name. The only names in here are Lazaro and his family. Everybody else is just the blind man, or the priest, or the friar, or the partner. All of these, the squire, all of these general categories of humanity. So you can read into them that they're not individuals so much as they're types, even as they have a lot of personality and a lot of individuality within them, without the name that's suggesting that you got to look at them as more of like a class of people. Because they're being discussed of in those terms. What do they do for a living? What is their social identity? So you have to look at it that way. So the first guy is a blind man. That's his most prominent characteristic. He's somebody who goes and begs, he begs, essentially, from town to town. He wanders around, and he prays for people, and he's so devout, and he's apparently quite good at it. And Lazaro will note that, he's interesting the way he goes, and, he's sort of subtle. A lot of people are doing this apparently these days. He's very reserved about it. He doesn't roll his eyes and get really hammy about it. He's a pro. And Lazaro respects that. But significantly, one of the first things that they do is, okay, he's a blind man, he needs somebody to lead him around. That's Lazaro's job. So the mom sends him off, has a touchingly brief and intimate little scene saying, be a good boy, and you, Mr. Blind Man, please take care of my son. Which is the most access we get to her character throughout. So that's significant, that, you know, the only time she gets dialogue really is when she is expressing concern for her son. So you got to take that at some face value. But he goes off with the blind man. The blind man, you know, he's leading him along. And they come to a big rock. And the blind man says, okay, you know, I want you to put your ear right next to that rock. And, you know, and listen really closely, because you're going to hear something very important. Lazaro, oh, okay, leans in. He just bashes the kid's head against the rock. And Lazaro just, ah. And then it's significant. Now, the blind man says, you know, you jerk, that's your first lesson in life. Life is hard, life is rough, don't trust anyone. Even an author? At that moment, Lazaro says, at that moment, I felt as if I had suddenly woken up from a stupor. This is his baptism into the reality of life. He is still a young child, but he has now been woken up into, oh, people don't necessarily care about me. People will lie to me. People will hurt me. I need to understand this. This is the way life is. And that's what that moment is. I'm saying it was as if I just woke up. Not because I doubt that he was knocked unconscious by bashing his head against a rock. Maybe it was, but it doesn't say that. And it's symbolic. And you need to be looking at those little moments throughout to see how he reacts to the world around him, because he's taking it all in and saying, oh, okay, no romantic illusions, no childish happy endings or anything. This is how life is. This is what I need to know. This is how I should understand it. And Lazaro seems okay with that, except for the fact that this guy doesn't feed him. The bare bones of this job is for Lazaro to walk him around, and in exchange for that, this blind man is supposed to give him some food. They don't. He is starving constantly. And just, you know, think about that for a second, and the humanity of starvation and the human pain, the animal nature of starvation. When somebody is hungry, they are reduced to a kind of animal state. That's all you can think about when you're hungry. And this is Lazaro's constant. And he's constantly saying, you know, can you just give me some food? And it's cruel. He's being abused. And they have a couple of different adventures together, and Lazaro's taking in all this information about how this guy is basically scamming people and going around and praying for them. And the first of many Catholic officials or Catholic representatives, let's just say, who are dishonorable, who are hypocritical. And it's going to get worse. Lazaro gets to a point where he's had enough, and he's started already tricking the blind man because he is blind. And one day they're stuck in like a rainstorm and they have to cross a river, and Lazaro says, well, okay, let me lead you to a spot in the river where we can jump across. The river's going very, very, very fast, and if you go in a deep part, it'll sweep you away. So let me lead you. So he leads him around, takes him on this little walk, and the blind man apparently has no idea where he's going. And Lazaro is sitting there narrating the whole way along the way, very reminiscent of, or perhaps a preview of Shakespeare in King Lear, when the fool is leading, not the fool, but, well, yeah, when Gloucester is being led to the cliffs of Dover. A great scene. But here, he leads the blind man around and then positions him in front of like a town flagpole or something, a town column in the middle of the square, nowhere near a river. And he says, okay, now when I say jump, you jump with all your might, and then you'll cross the river and you'll be safe. And the blind man, seemingly forgetting his first lesson about that rock, believes him. And he, in fact, even backs up a step or two and runs and jumps and bashes face first into this stone pole. And he cracks his head open. It's a bloody mess. And people come running, and Lazarillo just sort of, laughs and leaves. Now, in that, you get people running to help, and it's an interesting contrast where you have people who, follow their best instincts, the common people in general, ordinary people, the aggregate of them, are good. They come to help. And it is only the blind man and Lazarillo, to be perfectly honest, who are here the malicious elements within that society. And it's a complicated vision because it means that people are good and bad. Moral relativism again, just like they said at the beginning. Now from there, he goes through other masters, and he gets hooked up with a priest who again does not feed him, doesn't give him anything. He's supposed to be helping out around with the priest with some of the priest's duties, and the priest never feeds him. And this gets to a point where one of the things that the priest does, of course, is go to deliver last rites to people. And go to funerals. And Lazarillo admits at a certain point, it's really kind of funny that he liked going to the funerals because there would be food there and he could eat. And he got to the point where, he was kind of hoping for somebody to die every day. And he admits this. And it's funny. It is deeply immoral, but it's funny, and we're invited to laugh along with it and then feel a little bad with it because, we're supposed to be respectable, but we're laughing at this very, cruel instinct because we are good and bad too. It's fun. But he has to trick the priest in order to get out of that. The priest essentially beats him up. And more torture, essentially, with the starvation, and it's an ugly, ugly scene. He gets free of that. He goes wandering around, and he falls in with a local aristocrat, a squire, another representative of the establishment in society, an upper crust gentleman who is very conspicuous about his dress, and he's always putting on these very elaborate garments, and very concerned about his hands, has to wash his hands constantly, is very concerned about other people having clean hands. And the irony there is he has no money. He has a good name. He has an ancient name. He is Old Castilian, as he will tell you, one of those non-converso, definite, old families who are very, very respectable, but he has no money. And here we can see some of the influence of 1492 again, because as the New World was being exploited for all its resources, Spain was becoming very flush with money. And so you get rampant inflation and wild economic problems and displacement, and the old ways of life were being sort of shunted aside. And everything that the Squire had to offer society is no longer really all that relevant because other people have more money. And so he doesn't know what to do. He has no, he has no value in a modern society. And so he doesn't eat either. And when Lazarillo first falls in with him, he figures, this is great. I'm a rich guy. I'm going to be, I'm going to be chowing down on 3 squares a day. I'm going to feel great. It's going to be happy. It's going to be some decent work, but I'll be clean. I'll be fed. I'll be taken care of. Fantastic. I am set up. The irony, of course, is that the squire has no money. And in fact, does not feed him, lies to him about it. He'll say, oh, well, I ate this morning before you showed up, and I don't like to make a pig of myself, so I'm not going to eat for the rest of the day, and you shouldn't either. And like, oh, okay. And Lazarillo sees this going on, day after day, not eating anything, until finally he goes out and he manages to beg a little. And begging is also no longer allowed. There are laws against it. And Lazarillo sees people being whipped, poor people being whipped out of town, expelled from the town because they are begging in the streets. You're not allowed to do that anymore. So you get this sense of, this very detached and authoritarian government in opposition to just ordinary people trying to live. Lazarillo is taking all this in. He's not necessarily judging any of it. He's just recording it, saying, oh yeah, and then I saw that. He is completely amoral in the way he views things. But he starts surreptitiously begging a little, and even perhaps stealing a little, and he goes home. And the squire sees this and says, oh, Umbridge, well, you cannot do that. And this would be a stain on my honor. He's very conscious. The squire is very conscious of his honor and his dignity. And he cannot be seen to be associated with anything that is impure. And yet, as he watches Lazarillo eat the offal that he has pilfered, essentially, his mouth is watering because he hasn't eaten in days either. And Lazarillo lets him have something, a cow's foot. Very possibly, when you think about what a cow steps in also on a regular basis, it's not the choice cut. But the squire doesn't care. He just smells it and he just attacks it when Lazarillo gives it to him. And he starts going off about, oh, well, this is actually quite a delicacy. I would rather have this than pheasant. And, it's prepared properly and, with the right garlic and, and a few capers or something. And trying to make it seem like it's a gourmet delicacy. And, he's just starving and he'll eat anything at this point. And that's the point. And they fall into a habit where not only does the squire not feed Lazarillo, but Lazarillo has to go and beg so that he can feed the squire. So it's a complete reversal of the relationship. And in fact, this brings out something very touching in Lazarillo's nature. At the point where he is probably the most hungry, where he is the most desperate, where he is really at an economic and social low point for him. He is at the height of his humanity because he feels pity for the squire. He is going out and feeling bad for the squire, so he is bringing food back for the squire. And sometimes he brings back food and he won't even eat it himself because he figures, well, the squire needs it more. That kind of compassion, that humanity, that recognizing a common bond on a human level. They're no longer necessarily, at least in Lazarillo's mind, because he's starting to think independently of them, they're no longer the aristocrat and the lowly assistant. Now they're just human beings. And this marks a kind of a high point in his humanity. that is soon, like the episode with the rock, is soon turned against him. That instinct for love. Because one day bill collectors show up and the squire says, "Oh, well, I was just going out to the market to collect some debts, and I will have all the cash in the world to pay off what I owe you once, just come back in a few hours." And of course, perhaps swayed by his gentlemanly demeanor, his formality of dress, he's clearly from a good family, they believe him. And so they go away. And the squire leaves, presumably to go to this market to collect this money that he is owed, but he doesn't come back. And Lazaro's sitting there in the house waiting for him. And he's still a child. There are a couple of references at that moment where he says, and he didn't come back at night, and I was afraid to sleep there alone at night, so I went to the neighbor's house, which is something a young child would do. It's very unclear about the ages, but this is something that, this is not a teenager, I don't think. He's abandoned. He feels tossed out, kind of like the way his own mom tossed him out. But now it hurts in a different way because his mom really had no choice. Maybe the squire didn't have a choice, but Lazaro felt like they had established something, perhaps. Lazaro felt like, well, this isn't just an employer-employee relationship. I've been feeding you, and I've been taking care of you, and I have been caring for you in that. So you just left without a word. His mom at least gave him that touching little scene where you get the sense that she really felt torn up about it. But this guy just up and split, totally abandoning Lazaro when he really seemed to have been developing feelings for the squire. Maybe looking at him as a father figure, who knows? But it's heartbreaking. So he's alone once again. You get a very short fourth chapter of where he goes after that. Another example of religious hypocrisy. And let me just read this here. I had to find a fourth master. This one was a friar of the Order of Mercy. The woman next door led me to him. He was family to them. He was an enemy of singing in choirs and eating in monasteries. He loved wandering around, worldly affairs, and spending time visiting people. In fact, I believe he wore out more shoes than all others in the monastery put together. He gave me the first shoes I ever went through in my life. The pair didn't even last me more than 8 days. I couldn't keep up with him either. For this and for other little reasons I'd rather not mention, I left him. For other little reasons I'd rather not mention. That's a very pregnant phrase. He reminds us right now that this is an older person who is recalling the events of their youth. And a religious figure, a friar, a monk, did things for other reasons a young boy would rather not mention. There's no evidence, but you can let your imagination go as far as it can stomach. You get a sense of it's not quite right. A monk is supposed to be, of course, very removed. In a monastery is supposed to be separate outside of society for the most part. But here he loved going from door to door, seeing people wandering around. He loved worldly affairs. A monk, any monk, is not supposed to be so much of this world. They're supposed to be focused on the other world, the afterlife, heaven, God, all of that stuff. This one seems to have a different agenda, and that's troubling. So he's on his own again, perhaps by his own volition at this point. He's not abandoned, but again, he's learned another harsh lesson. This one again from another member of the church. This one again reminding him never to trust anyone, perhaps not even an author. He falls in with a pardoner who is selling indulgences, and he learns how to travel from town to town and scam people. He starts to turn morally as he watches them sit there and scam whole groups of people and take their money and run off and promise them, yeah, take some of these tickets and you'll get out of heaven, or you'll get into heaven much faster. You'll be forgiven your sins by the Pope. He says, I came to understand how one had benefited from the other and how inventive my master really was. Talking about his master, the pardoner or whatever, and an accomplice. And he's starting to respect the way these people scam people. I came to understand how inventive my master really was. He's starting to, wow, admiring somebody for the way they scam old peasants, people who are just fearful of God. So now, after the moral high point of compassion for the squire, a few more rough beats along the way, and he's starting to say, well, gee, maybe there's a certain artfulness. Maybe there's something admirable in the way you can cheat suckers. It's very awkward what he goes through. It's very uncomfortable to watch. And one after the other, he sees people being scanned by this, and he's on the inside of it. Ordinary, common people, but he is an outlaw to that society by being an outcast. And he's starting to align with the predators among them. A couple more of these sequences happen, and he finds himself a little older. He has secured himself a nice little job. He is a town crier. He delivers news about crime, what has been happening in town. I believe he's in Toledo at this point, and his background in crime probably helps him with this, gives him a little perspective, so he's still sort of in the crime milieu, if you will. He talks an awful lot about being part of his duties involves being involved in the wine trade. So again, wine, certain illicit quality there, also perhaps sacrificial in the Catholic sense, but he is also, it is suggested, a little corrupt, to such an extent that any investor selling in wine in the city is aware of Lazarillo of Tormes is a go-between. He's on the take. He can, whatever his specific duties are, he's willing to look the other way on certain things, presumably if things are okay for him. So you can see the moral quandary is still very uncomfortable. He is even introduced to a nice girl. The local archbishop has a maid who works in his house, and fixes him up with Lazarillo. And Lazarillo is sort of taken with this, and they get a nice little house next to the archbishop's house. The archbishop is probably fairly well off, and it's a nice house. He is set up. He has Sunday dinners with the archbishop. They have lunch together all the time. It's a nice, comfortable life, and all his wife has to do is maintain her life as a maid for the archbishop, which involves long hours over at the archbishop's house, often for quite a while after dark. Rumors start, and Lazarillo is very offended by this. Oh, how could you say this? What are you impugning about my wife? And it's very obvious that the archbishop of the Catholic Church, is having an affair with his maid, and arranged this little marriage to put a happy face on the situation. Now he has the maid nearby at all times, and Lazarillo just has to be a willing and silent accomplice in this. And Lazarillo is having trouble swallowing this, or maybe he's not having enough trouble swallowing it. The text doesn't really make it clear. There's never a shortage of rumors. They don't leave us in peace. People say, I don't know what goes on when my wife makes his bed or cooks for him. May God help those who lie. May God help those who lie. Doesn't say who they might be. Is that the archbishop? Is that his wife? Is that all of the people who are trafficking in these unfounded rumors? It doesn't say. To confess, I myself have been suspicious during this period. Sometimes I have to wait long after dinner. Sometimes it even gets cold. Sometimes it even gets worse. I frequently recall what the blind man from Escalona told me with his hand on the horn, though to tell the truth, I have the impression the devil brings him back to my mind so as to bring discord between me and my wife. The devil stirs up these memories of his past. The devil. Now, okay, Catholic, whatever. But it's a sign of a bit of a division between his mind and his soul, his mind and reality, what he wants to believe and what he kind of suspects. There is a sense of a division, which plays into the Renaissance trope of the human being is infinite. The human being is bottomless. The human mind goes on forever. And you can't go through life with a skewed version of that. You can't exist on the surface and you get a sense of the real torment that is going on, because he does dwell on this quite a bit about his wife and how he is being now just one of the suckers, perhaps. Yeah, his life is cushy. Yeah, he's got lots of money, but what is that money really worth? Does he trust anyone? Can he trust anyone? What is the use of being him, of being good, if it all feels so cheap? And he's trying not to think of this. He's trying not to dwell on these ugly aspects, but it's right there. And so when he began the story of, you got to look at the good and the bad, that goes for yourself too. Self-assessment of the good and the bad is important, and you can't just put a happy face on anything like this author, this character, this identity seems to be trying to do as a respectable member of society, as the right-hand man, perhaps, of the archbishop. You can't overlook if you want it to be true.